Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. An expectant hush falls over the room. Just to warn you all who haven't endured my meetings before, I like running to time. And that applies to all the speakers as well. Just a little warning in advance. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to hand over immediately to Fiona Johnson, who's going to read what I call the housekeeping. But before I do, I just want to say thank you, because largely it's her efforts that have brought all this summit together. So well done, Fiona. Housekeeping, please.
Thank you, Henry. I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting and quickly go over some general housekeeping. This meeting is being held in person at County Hall and is also being streamed live. A fire alarm test is not expected during this meeting. If the alarm sounds, we must evacuate County Hall. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest exit and meet at the muster point located in the main car park. Later on, we have the panel discussion. If you're asking a question for the microphones, when using your microphone, please make sure it's switched on and speak towards it. This will tell the cameras to focus on you and ensure that you can be heard on the live stream. When you've finished speaking, please push the button to turn off your microphone, as this will allow the system to pick up the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, I'm really grateful that you're all here, because for me, protecting the residents of Norfolk against the challenges of the future, be it climate change, sea level rise, increasing weather events, is hugely important. And the one thing over the years that I've met when people are flooded, they say, please do not let me be flooded again. And if anybody has been flooded, and I know Alison's going to be talking about it in a minute, it is a devastating effect on your life. And it would appear that around the world, we've got more and more extreme events, be it in Los Angeles, be it in Leicestershire the other week, or Lincolnshire. And they are becoming the norm. The news and the media like to portray them as being unprecedented. But at what point, when something keeps happening, do we say, perhaps the new normal is very different from what the past is, and the past might not be the best way to govern the future? And I think the only way that we're going to cope with the future is by working together, by collaborating together. Now, that is the whole structure of what the Norfolk Strategic Flooding Alliance is about. Collaborating in partnership with one another, building that trust between different parties so that when there is a crisis, we know who to speak to and everybody works together to solve the problems. Because we're not going to be able to stop the problems. We just hope to make them much easier to solve when there is for the residents we represent. So enough from me on that, and I'm going to hand straight over to Councillor Andrew Jemison, Deputy Leader, to set the scene. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. And I'd like to echo Henry's thanks to you all for attending today and his call for collaboration. This is the key word, I think, going forward. We've talked enough, and what we're going to show today, I think, is the way we're actually managing to get stuff done on the ground. So over the course of this morning, we're going to hear from the very real personal stories of people who are impacted by flooding, and how we as a county have come together to respond and rebuild alongside the work of our MPs and what they're doing to raise the issue higher on the government agenda. But as a numbers man, I want to speak on the cost of flooding against the cost of prevention. We know only too well all the competing priorities which are creating and which are using our public money. Demand for money has never been higher, and life has never been more complex. Budgets have never been more stretched. But anyone following the news recently will have seen the government's emerging proposals for local government organisation and for the devolution of powers. This is not a distraction. I see this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do things better for residents. We have the chance to reduce the bureaucratic barriers and the red tape, whilst vitally saving public money. We can rethink this. We only have to look at the bizarre arrangements of flood maintenance funding and the responsibilities that we have to work around to see that they're split over a whole different layers of local government. It creates confusion and it's increased red tape. It silos people. It's clear that the current system doesn't make sense either for the local flood authorities, which is in our case is of course Norfolk County Council, where we have responsibility for flooding but no authority to actually get people to do anything, or for the residents that they serve. And so how we respond to flooding could be a real litmus test now of how things can be done better under a new local government arrangement. I'm excited to do things better and to see what significant opportunities hold in store for Norfolk. And I look forward to working with government and our officers here in Norfolk to ensure that we can make the most of that. I'm now very briefly going to focus on preventative spend and how investing in our flood defences can pay a real dividend. We know that each £1 spent on flood defence can mitigate £14 worth of damage. But that £14 is not just money. It represents a community which hasn't been flooded, a business which hasn't needed to shut down, or vital local infrastructure which hasn't been destroyed by floodwater. The government has committed £2.4 billion over the next 2 years for flood defences, but has said that it is necessary to review these plans from 25-26. I know the government, like all of us, have significant financial gaps to plug and budgets to balance, but the message from Norfolk needs to be that spending on our flood defences should be the last domino to fall. The minute that we stop funding preventative measures, we will have far greater costs arrive on our doorstep, literally. And that is a false economy. Our own members of parliament and the flooding minister herself have agreed that we need to make maintenance sexy. But we can't do that without money. Let's briefly work on by the NSFA. We need to look no further than our own partnership arrangements with the Norfolk Strategic Flooding Authority to see how a little funding can go a long way. Since the flooding in 2023, the NSFA has coordinated with other agencies to create multi-agency groups in areas surrounding the River Burn, for example, which is in my division. These have delivered significant progress to reduce the future risk of flooding to local residents. Anglian Water has invested more than £347,000 over the last 12 months to deliver works across Burnham Market, Burnham Thorpe, and around the River Burn, as well as North and South Creek. Again, each pound spent towards a new sewer monitor to find and fix issues in the water network before they get severe, or simple improvements such as sealed covers to prevent excessive surface water entering the sewer system. It's not exciting, but let's make it sexy. There are other improvements. They help people day in, day out. The work going on the River Burn is just a small example of what can happen when we work well together. And this is exactly what today is all about. While Norfolk is uniquely vulnerable to flooding due to our low-lying geography, our fantastic networks of rivers and broads, we're also uniquely poised to make a telling contribution to the national debate. Today is about learning from each other on how we can do things better, and perhaps even sharing with government how we feel things can be done better overall. While we obviously cannot control future weather events look like, we know that winters are getting wetter, and with that comes more risk of flooding. Just last year, Norfolk experienced the wettest 6 months from September to March that it has ever seen. All the while, drought remains a risk too, even if it seems incredibly far from our minds at the moment. The key point is that even if we cannot directly control the causes, we can certainly control how we prepare for and respond to flooding and to drought events through strong partnerships like the NSFA in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. And thank you for keeping to time. Very helpful. I'm not going to invite any questions at this point because you're going to have the opportunity for questions to the panel later on in this summit. But you make some wonderful points there, and thank you. You talked about the personal impact. So what better person now than Alison? You have got personal experience, so over to you. Share your story, please.
Thank you. I'm good. Technology is not my thing, so let's see. Alex has got his fingers crossed. So my job is to bring you all into the real world, to remind you what we're all here to do, and to think about how we might act differently, how we might work together differently to change outcomes. The reason I've put this picture up is because this is the evening of the 23rd of December 2020. We had just come out of a permitted short period of lockdown to allow family members to get together for Christmas. This is my youngest daughter and I. It was her 21st birthday on the 18th of December that year, and she had driven up from Portsmouth for us to go out for a meal to celebrate her birthday. So this is us in our glad rags before we left. Nope, don't seem to be working. And this is what we came home to. I don't know quite how to describe this, really. We'd had heavy rain for the entire day, but we'd also had prolonged rainfall for nearly 2 months before that was saturating the ground. Those of you who are familiar with Long Stratton, which is where I live, will know that actually it's a clay subsoil, as our contractors building the bypass are discovering at the moment. That means that the water runs off rather than soaks in. And once you've saturated that top area, there's nowhere for it to go. We had issues with ditches. I was walking my dog regularly. The fields were incredibly muddy. The ditches were up to capacity. We also had problems with the road drainage. I had already mentioned to my highway engineer, the water's coming up the drain rather than going down it. And that had been happening all the way through the autumn. So we had a month's rain in an afternoon and evening. And this is what we came back to. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. Oh, sorry, my apologies. I did tell you technology was not my thing. So this is a picture just to demonstrate what the A140, which is not a canal or a river or a watercourse, looked like on that night. And the reason I'm holding my wellies is because I'd actually gone into the house to check on the dog, took my wellies off to keep my house clean, and then realised that my feet were soaking wet. So our attempts to bucket the water over the wall to protect our property, because it hadn't got to the front door at that point, was futile. We were already flooded. So there was no point in putting my wellies back on because my socks were wet and I was going to make the inside of my wellies wet. So I went out to say we need to change our attack. We need to get in and we need to save as much of our personal property and our treasured possessions as we possibly can. So that was what happened that night. It was Christmas. There was also a 21st birthday cake on the dining room table, which was high enough to not get wet. There were also, I did think actually when we got home to move all the Christmas presents that had been around the Christmas tree onto the table. So they were saved too. But it's bizarre the things that you go and save and then the things that you realise you didn't save and you should have, like photograph albums in a cupboard that was on the floor, for example. This is my daughter, having changed out of her glad rags with a newly done hairdo, actually using our pond pump to try and pump the sitting room out of the sitting room window. So it's all hands to the deck when things like this happen. That just gives you an example. I was going to cook a Christmas turkey in that oven. 48 hours later, I didn't, as you can imagine. And that's what that room that you saw earlier looked like when the contractors came in and started their work. And I have to say that whilst the flood was a traumatic and really difficult experience, once you realise you're up against elements that you can't control, you kind of realise, okay, we've got to accept that this is what's happening. What we've got to do is make the best of it. So that night we made the best of it. The next day, it was like Challenge Annika in our house. People came to help, but because of COVID restrictions, I said, we better keep family groups to individual rooms. So we had one family group in the dining room, we had one family group in the sitting room, etc., etc. And they'd said, can we bring anything? And I said, can you bring mops, please, and mop buckets? Because on Christmas Eve, Co-op didn't have any. So everybody arrived mop-handed rather than mob-handed. And that's when the work began. So that was the 23rd of December, and we moved back into our home on the 30th of July. But it wasn't finished because the contractor didn't honour their agreement. They were tardy, to say the least. They didn't follow the specification that was laid out. They treated our home with no respect whatsoever. And treated us with very little respect, actually disdain, because they were rather annoyed that we had an annex which wasn't affected. And whenever we went out, the people we were renting the property from April through to July said, if you're going out for the day, could you take your dog somewhere else? So of course we'd take our dog back to the house, and they didn't like the fact that we were keeping a close eye on them. Well, thank goodness we were, because it was a £90,000 claim. A lot of that was actually our accommodation. We were fortunate that we had people who came forward and offered us accommodation, and one of my district council colleagues at the time saved us, absolutely saved us, said you can use our property, it'll be clean and ready for you on Boxing Day, and you can move in. And we arrived, and the wood burner was lit, and the Christmas tree was up, and that house put its hands around us and supported us for those hard 4 months while we were in lockdown. So I couldn't go and choose a new sofa. I couldn't, go and look at what furnishings we might need to replace, because nowhere was open. And then we knew there'd be a rush when everything was open, that everybody who wanted to change the sofa because they didn't like the colour of it would find that actually, we were in a queue and I didn't have a sofa at all. So getting replacement items was incredibly difficult. Keeping contractors on task was insurmountably difficult. My husband is a construction insurance broker. He's now retired of 40 plus years. The contract that we were provided by the insurance company was one that he said he couldn't sign. The reason he couldn't sign it was because it transferred the contractor onto our household policy. If we'd done that and the contractor had burnt our house down whilst putting it back together for the flood, we wouldn't have been covered. And they said, but that's what we give to everybody. And he said, well, I'll have to rewrite the contract. So he rewrote the contract and signed it. But what concerned us was, what about all the other people who were sent a contract by their insurance company that was wrong, that wouldn't have covered them if something had happened and the contractor had made a mistake? And let's remember, you think of the Glasgow School of Art. It burnt down because a contractor made a mistake. So believe you me, there are things that need to change. The standard of the work was terrible. And actually, I don't think the contractor made a penny out of the job, and quite rightly so. But so what happens afterwards? It's now post-event. We were out of our home for 8 months, and then we have to move on. So the insurance impact, just for you to be interested, our insurance brokers were really good. Our loss adjuster was really good, partly because they knew my husband worked for a very big construction broker, and it was probably in their interests to be really good. But after 3 years, they just said, we're not going to offer you terms. Previously, our insurance renewal had been in the ballpark of what it had been before. Last year, they said, we're not going to offer you terms. So my husband went out to find out, see if he could find some quotes. It had been £260 a year. The quotes he got were over 2,000. And it cost us 1,544 because he broke it himself. So I suppose, what do you want me to say? What is the outcome? People need help, practical help on the ground, because we were capable, competent people who knew our way around the system, but were still vulnerable. Timely action. If we see that there's a problem, we need to take action. And I think we need to listen to local knowledge. We've had incidents in Long Stratton where we have raised concerns. And in fact, that flood that started on the 23rd of December, the indications started on the 4th of December. And the water didn't go away in its entirety until the 20th of January. Even though Anglian Water, I'm sorry to call you out, but even though Anglian Water said there wasn't a problem with their system, we eventually found a very large tree root in the system, and they sorted it out overnight and the water went away. So I suppose what I'm wanting to say to you is, don't forget that in the same way as when we talk about NHS reform, we have to think about a patient in the bed. When we're talking about pulling together and doing something positive and lasting for the people of Norfolk, so none of them have to go through the scenario that I went through and have the pain and upset of losing special things, that we remember that there's a homeowner, a family, and a life that's hugely impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. A very personal story, and I think by the silence in the room, you all understand the depth of trauma that Alison and her family went through. So if we can prevent it in the first place, that must be a very good place to start. Now, Rob Kelly, you're next, but before you begin speaking, I'd just like to thank Anglian Water, who've enabled you to come and help us for the last year, well, the last 9 months, 10 months. And Rob has made a huge difference because he's one of those people who delivers and gets stuff done. So Rob, how do you get stuff done?
Thank you, Henry. I'll try my very best to keep to time, but I think I've left my phone in the toilet, so you'll have to flash me if I'm going over. So I'd like to start with a bit of reflection, actually, on my last 9 months. I'll let you settle down. Thank you. But firstly, it is a total honour to be in this room today with you. And when I first joined, it felt like an organisation that, let's face it, sounded like it should have its own superhero team. And in some ways, that's exactly what we are. A team of different powers, abilities, brought together for one mission: to protect Norfolk from the devastating effects of flooding. Now, unfortunately, we don't wear capes, although Henry's high-vis jacket does come very close. Tackling flooding is a really complex problem. And as Alan's alluded to, it doesn't knock politely at the door. It doesn't ask permission to come in. It barges in uninvited, and it makes itself at home, leaving a trail of damage, destruction, and despair. But while flooding doesn't follow the rules, it's really important that we do. So we're tackling that by embracing a systems approach, systems thinking, and a collaborative approach. So the key to this for me has been listening well, listening to people like Alison, listening to the agencies, listening to the communities to understand what it feels like and what we need to do to improve the position. And back in 2020, this particular storm, I witnessed with George on many conference calls as we were back then, agencies coming together to work brilliantly well, actually, but in a crisis. That's when they genuinely come together, and that's when things start to, get momentum. My job over the last 10 months is to get that same level of engagement from all of the agencies, all the organisations in peacetime when we are not in flood. So the impact that one organisation can have on another, and explaining that and having people talk to each other, communication and collaboration is absolutely key. So when I talk about systems thinking, I can see some of you nodding along sagely, and I can see other people sort of looking and going, well, do you just mean joining the dots? Well, yes and no. Systems thinking here is about recognising that flooding is not just a drainage issue, it's not just a climate issue, it's not just a planning issue, it's all of those things and then some. I've likened it, believe it or not, to trying to untangle a bowl of spaghetti with somebody continuing adding pasta in. And what you actually have to do is take a step back, look at that entire messy picture and start to strategise about how you could straighten it out. And that's exactly where the NSFA has come in. We're not just patching holes or sticking our fingers in the proverbial dike. That one was for you, Peter. Although, let's be honest, there's a bit of that over the years. Our role is to pull all the agencies together, the councils, utility companies, emergency services, environmental experts, and make sure we're all singing from the same soggy hymn sheet. Imagine, if you will, and it can feel like this at time, a rowboat. Everybody has an oar, all of these organisations. Someone's rowing forward, someone's rowing backwards, someone's bailing out at a frantic pace, and somebody's sat on their backside not doing a great deal. Well, if you all pull in the same direction, guess what happens? You start to get some momentum. And a wise man once said to me, if you hit a sandbank, you think you need to row harder. Actually, you just need to get your head up sometimes and look at where you're going. And that's what we've tried to do over the last 9 to 10 months. So when we align our efforts, we can get somewhere. And as Andrew alluded to, we've had some really good successes in the Burn catchment, where all agencies are responsible for something. And they've worked brilliantly together, and they've invested money, and they've met monthly. That's been really positive. And equally, another example of just how complex it is Hickling. So some of you will be aware of the issues faced in Hickling, particularly last winter. Well, every single agency in this room had a part to play. Every single agency has invested. The EA and the IDB have collaborated brilliantly to raise the banks, and that has been a truly, truly wonderful project. Now, will it stop Hickling flooding ever again? Well, I don't think that's possible, but will it have improved the position? Yes, absolutely. And now the community know, and that's really, really important. So I applaud those people in the audience who've made that possible. So one of the key things for us has been absolutely systems thinking, and it helps us understand the interconnectedness of everything, as per Hickling, as per the Burn catchment, and how rainfall in one part of Norfolk can cascade, pun intended, into problems elsewhere, how urban development affects natural drainage, and how every agency's decision can ripple through the system. It's about seeing the bigger picture and recognising that solving flooding can be about quick fixes, but it's also about smarter, joined-up solutions, and above all else, ensuring our systems are well maintained and free-flowing, holding water up where it can be stored safely. Of course, pulling everybody together has not necessarily been easy. It can feel a bit like herding cats, or in our situation, herding engineers, policymakers, project managers, and utility companies, and. Each organisation has its own priorities, its own budgets, and dare I say it, its own quirks. But here's where the opportunity lies. By working together efficiently, we can deliver more for less. Think about it. Instead of everybody working in their individual silos, duplicating efforts, or even worse, unintentionally undermining each other, we have the opportunity to pool resources, share data, create solutions that benefit everybody. It's absolutely about moving from reactive to proactive, from piecemeal to holistic. And as Andrew said, thank you, Andrew, for every £1 you spend on maintenance, you get £14 return. Well, who wouldn't want some of that? And it's not just about the money, as Andrew quite rightly said. It's about that means that something might not go wrong. Very difficult to prove, but at least you can stand there and say, we've done what we could. Ultimately, it's about saving homes and livelihoods and businesses. It's about real people, the families who don't have to wade through their living rooms, the businesses that can keep their door open, the communities that can thrive, not just survive. Less talk, more action. And I've been heartened by the amount of work we've got through in my 10 months. And yet, despite the challenges, I have been continually inspired by the resilience, creativity, and downright determination of the people of Norfolk and the people in this room and beyond. Whether that's designing new flood defence, mapping risk areas, talking to people, cleaning out ditches, or simply turning up with a mop and bucket when disaster strikes, Norfolk's spirit shines through. So as we move forward, let's remember what makes the NSFA unique. It's not just the systems thinking or the efficiency. It's the way it brings people together, just like today. It's the way we turn challenges into opportunities. It's the way we approach a very serious issue with both seriousness and hope. Just one paragraph left, Henry. Because while flooding may be inevitable, the damage it causes doesn't have to be. Together, with systems thinking and a collaborative spirit, we can build a Norfolk that's not just resilient but adaptable. A Norfolk that's better protected, and where legislative gaps exist, it is leadership that will drive us forward. Bravery to try something different, bravery to trust a neighbouring organisation to deliver on your behalf, bravery to step into a space that can be particularly uncomfortable, particularly when you have to go and visit people affected like Alison. It is not a comfortable space for people to work in. But above all else, and some of you will heard me say this before, maintenance is absolutely key. We absolutely love big, shiny capital infrastructure projects in this country, quite rightly so. But we need to focus our effort, our money and our attention into maintaining the assets we already have. And thanks to Steph's debate in Westminster and Andrew this morning, my words, make maintenance sexy, will forever be in Hansard. And who would have thought that? So finally, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for all of your support to the NSFA over the past 10 months. Keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And you've been at the sharp end of it. And those words I know are from experience. And you speak with that same passion that Alison and Andrew and everybody on this panel shares. No less passion than I know that George Freeman's now going to speak with, who's very closely involved not only with the residents of Attleborough and their flooding problems, but also trying to influence in the Houses of Parliament with our MPs cross-party to make a difference. George.
Thank you also to Fiona for the work that you've done in pulling this together and in trying to coordinate a nightmare of cats in some sort of strategic framework for Norfolk. I called for this summit, and I'm really grateful that you've pulled it together and convened it, and not as a sort of one-off to stroke the problem, but as the first of what I think should be an annual event in Norfolk for all of those communities that are affected and their elected representatives, district, county, town and parish councillors and MPs, to hold the agencies to account and to be clear what the problem is and where it's getting worse and why, and come up with an action plan. And the tenor of this morning, Henry, I think is spot on. And I really hope at the end of today, we can have gone through properly and worked out and mapped and agreed some action plans of the 3, 4, 5 things that we as a community need to do better in the next 12 months, and then come back and report on how we're doing. And it's great that we've got so many town and parish councils online in a blow for digital democracy, able to participate, and I'm sure they'll be able to ask some questions later as well. So thank you for pulling it together. I want to bring you, just to frame the problem that I think we all understand, but not everyone in Whitehall understands, to Mill Lane in Attleborough. It's a lane in the north of Attleborough, and I should just say that for me, this became a huge campaigning, crusading mission in January 21, because in Christmas 2020, like many of you here, I spent a large part of a week helping villages. There were 14 villages that Christmas in Mid Norfolk flooded, hundreds of houses, sewage in people's houses, tankers turning up occasionally, people with buckets. And it is, admirable to pay testament to the spirit of Norfolk. But to be honest, the people in Mid Norfolk pay their taxes, and they shouldn't, they have a right to expect, I think, that a basic contract as homeowners and house dwellers is maintained by the state. And I view this as a fundamental breakdown of a contract between the state at national and local level and householders. So there were 19 villages across Mid Norfolk affected. We set up the Mid Norfolk Flood Alliance in January so that we could all share best practice, agree the 15 things that everyone knew had to be sorted. And then County moved quickly and set up the Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance, originally Lord Dannatt, and now led brilliantly by Henry. And I think the people listening to this want to hear us make sure that we're gripping the scale of the problem and clear about what has to change. So come with me on a journey to North Attleborough, Mill Lane. It's a very standard residential lane you could recognise in any of Norfolk's towns. And 30 years ago, it was originally developed, and it's now part of an ever-growing town. Attleborough's got another 4,500 houses coming, and it's called Mill Lane. The clue's in the title, right? There's a culvert of a little dike that flows under Mill Lane and for the last 8 years, the 5 houses around the culvert where it goes under the road have had a foot of sewage in their house every winter. Last year, 100 houses, their neighbours, all had water up to, and in some cases over their lintels and in their houses. I want to bring you to the worst affected house. Hans and Lynn Short are the people who live in the house next to the culvert and have had sewage in their house every year for 6 years. They're incredibly patient people, far more patient than any of us have a right to deserve or expect them to be. And it was only when I rang Henry and Fiona came down, we've put together a huge project to try and sort the problem out. And I'm just going to describe briefly what we've had to do, because the problem is multifaceted. Firstly, the culvert, the responsibility, the riparian rights were transferred without anyone's knowledge from Anglian Water to, no one's quite clear, but they were handed over quietly several years ago. So no one's been repairing and maintaining that culvert. The volume of water has gone up hugely, as we all know. The volume of house building has gone up hugely. The ditch is full of rubbish, bicycles, gravel, silt, all sorts of stuff. The water isn't being held upstream well enough, so there's no retention of water. It floods right through, and then downstream houses are being built. Well, it's taken a huge multi-agency project, clearing, I think, 30 tons out of the whole of that stretch of river. The community's formed a group, they're monitoring the water. We've had to replace the very ill-designed culvert cover that was building up trash and leading to the flooding. But this is going on all around the country. And we cannot be spending £200,000 or £300,000 in multi-agency partnerships at every mill lane in the country. But that is what is going to happen if we don't get this right. And I think we owe it to the Hans and Lynn Shorts of this world that we grip this properly and set out a plan today to come back to it, because the Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance is doing great work, as you say, emergency work, but it's emergency work. We've got to make sure that we prevent it. So we all know, I think, the causes. Yes, climate change. We've had the wettest months, pretty much 14, 15 wettest record months on record. Huge neglect of maintenance, both local ditches and, contract farming in this part of the world. I come from a farm. In the old days, quiet months, you'd put people on the farm on to mending fences and clearing ditches. But contract farming doesn't allow for that these days. People are working flat out, driving around, doing their contract, drilling, cultivating. So the old structure of farming has changed. But also the Environment Agency. I mean, I do want to say that part of their job is to keep the rivers flowing. Of course, we like to have flowers and silt and birds, but the rivers have a job, which is to get the water out of Norfolk into the sea. And, so there's maintenance at every level. We have a huge lack of reservoirs. People are asking, well, why are we flooding in the winter and dry in the summer? Because we're not capturing enough water. And why have we made it so hard for farmers to build reservoirs? Well, partly the Environment Agency, the other bit of them. So we really don't have a properly joined up landscape for it. We're building far too many houses in floodplains and not improving the drainage infrastructure. Lots of big housing estates dumped in my patch on the outskirts of villages, and the drains just plugged into old Victorian drains. They're not being upgraded. And then when they flood, of course, sewage starts pouring up through everyone's houses, and a real confusion about riparian rights. So, to be fair to the Norfolk agencies, 30 organisations in Norfolk have responsibility for flood prevention and management. I mean, this is ridiculous. Nothing will get done, or bits of emergency work will get done when the 30 can be all got together. And it's admirable that it happens sometimes, but it's no basis on which the people of this county should be asked to live happily with. So, to be fair, the national framework also needs sorting out, which is what the bill that I've drafted and I'm working on does. We're in the process of polishing it and working with an ever-growing number of partners, but it's very simple. It has 4 clauses and 4 aims. The first is responsibilities, the second is funding, the third is liabilities, and the fourth is data and mapping. Responsibilities, we need a much clearer set of responsibilities in London. The Cabinet Office need to be mapping flooding across the country and gripping it as a national resilience issue. Norfolk is ranked 8 of the 10 worst affected counties. So this isn't a small local problem, this is a national problem, and pretty soon we're going to start to see national infrastructure affected. So the costs will go through the roof, but we also need local responsibilities recognised and respected. The internal drainage boards have managed water catchments for hundreds of years very successfully. Their budgets are being squeezed. The district council is responsible for them. Their budgets are being squeezed. So we need to top slice some Environment Agency money down to support the responsibilities on the ground. You can't have a Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance that doesn't have any money. So the responsibilities have got to be mapped. And then clause 2, the funding needs to follow. Clause 3 is going to be controversial, but I'm trying to answer the question, how do we get house builders and developers to invest up front in the improved drainage infrastructure? Well, it seems to me the only way is to make them liable for flooding downstream when they've built large numbers of houses which lead to flooding. And I think that will get the directors of developing companies to say, look, I think it's better that we upgrade the drainage when we put it in. And clause 4 deals with data and mapping. I sat down with the Met Office last week and with the Environment Agency, both of whom have terabytes of data. And the Met Office is the world's leading institute for climate mapping. I used to be their minister. I mean, it's a phenomenal organization. So when I asked them, surely you now, when you see a rain pattern, when you see rainfall pattern at a certain time of year, and you've got the hydrology data, you can predict that rain, which is coming on Monday and lands on wet land in those counties, will lead to flooding in those villages 24, 36, 48 hours later. But they're not. What they do is they issue a sort of yellow cloud warning to say it's probably going to flood somewhere in East Anglia. We know that. What the people of Mill Lane need to know is you are going to have a surge on Tuesday morning. They know that, actually. They're ahead of the agencies here. But this is not impossible. We've got the data. We're just not using it properly. And Henry, I do think here in Norfolk, we should have a digital map. We'll just start with a physical one would be good, of where this year did we see inland flooding, and which are the new places that haven't had it traditionally, where it's now beginning to appear. If we don't map it and catch the data, we can't manage it. And we can't keep being in this reactive mode of somebody in some village has got a problem, and only when 100 people get a problem will we go and see it. We have to collect that data better. So that's what the bill seeks to do, and I'm working cross-party. The good news is the new MPs in Parliament, 250 odd, it's a sign of how serious this is as a national issue that there are now 4 all-party parliamentary groups for flooding. Forming an all-party parliamentary group is not for the faint-hearted. You need sort of 20 MPs, you need to be quorate, and you need to have... they each have about 50 members. And that tells you how significant an issue it is. And I think Emma Hardy, the flooding minister, is gripping it. And I've suggested that all 4 APPGs have a summit in Portcullis House with 80 MPs to make sure that her civil servants understand how urgent this is and how much support she has behind her to be bold. Because we can't just sort of talk about the problem for another 6 years. We have to properly grip it. And so that's what the bill does. And I think by working cross-party, and I'm really cheered that a new generation of MPs, including Steph here next door, but also if you look at Norfolk, we've got 4 Labour MPs, 3 Conservative MPs, a Liberal Democrat, and a Reform MP and half a Green in Adrian Ramsey. We ought to be able to show how you come together in a cross-party spirit and speak as a county that knows a thing or two about flooding and help the minister get this right. Henry, I will stop there.
Your own timer.
I'm 6 minutes within my time.
You are. Thank you very much. Now, you've reintroduced Steph, and Steph has already hosted a meeting in Hickling for the residents of Hickling. Steph, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see so many colleagues from Norfolk County Council, from district councils, and from Parliament here as well. I think this is the most number of Norfolk MPs I've seen at an event so far in my tenure. I am one of the, I think it's 350 new MPs. And I wanted to share with you a couple of reflections about what can and can't be done within the current parliamentary system, and how George has given you a fantastic example in his bill. I totally support George's bill. But it's been quite an interesting experience going from a corporate world where more or less what someone in charge says can draw a straight line to the things people do, to the world of parliament and politics where those straight lines just don't exist. And that's actually really good news for MPs that aren't in the governing party. It's probably good news for all MPs, because although people get cross with talk, actually talk is how change happens. You're not going to see many of us here today leave this chamber and go and pick up a shovel and start to redig a culvert. But you might find that the sort of conversations we can have, if we can focus them and clarify them, do lead to the sort of change that we want to see. And I want to talk about two examples of this. We've already heard mention of the Westminster Hall debate, where I got Rob's words into Hansard, and that was a great pleasure. Even the minister herself played them back, which is excellent. For those of you who aren't acquainted with this, Westminster Hall is a room they built in Parliament because there were too many MPs trying to say things in the main chamber on the green benches. So they thought, well, let's have another space where we can put them to say things. And like all non-governmental debates, basically, it's just as useful at getting the attention of ministers, because they have to send someone from the government to listen to the whole debate and report back at the end of it. And you might think, what a tedious job that is. Well, it depends on the topic, frankly. I've sat through some intriguing niche Westminster Hall debates, but also some really important ones. They don't change policy, but they do provide an opportunity to land really important points with the people who are going to be making the decisions about future policy. And, you know, in a good day where something that's said actually makes it into legislation, there will be no straight line because the people in the debate aren't the ones in charge, but the minister has that influence. And so, yeah, lots of people spoke in this Westminster Hall debate on flooding in Norfolk before Christmas. I was very keen to emphasise our geographical vulnerability, but also our cultural heritage. Places like Haysborough, for example, have redefined the beginning of the Anthropocene. In the last 35 years, this has been a complete change in how we thought humankind evolved from mainland Europe, and it happened right here on our doorstep. So it's not just the number of chimney pots that matters, it's the other assets that we want to consider how to protect. I'll come back to that in a moment. I also wanted to make sure that the community concerns were got across, and that the minister really understood, like we've heard from Alison today, the reality of the impact of this stuff on people's lives. But I also wanted to use it as a call for unified action. And that's the theme that I've certainly heard most so far this morning, is this important ambition to de-silo and to strengthen the common cause and common purpose of what all these different well-meaning agencies and professionals are trying to achieve. This is not an issue that's limited to flooding. It actually pervades and prevails throughout the entirety of Westminster politics. And it's one of my most striking reflections so far is that I've worked with lots of different industry sectors and seen them all completely transform in the last 30 years. They've rewired the way they work around new possibilities that are enabled by data, by modern design, by being able to build what they do around their customers' experience, not the convenience of their organizations. And that change, that just hasn't happened in Westminster politics at all. That's not a slight against civil servants or party politics. It's a design flaw that the whole way in which government works is siloed. And yet the things that we want to do cross-cut those silos, and no sharper evidence of this is there than in flooding. So I wanted to highlight that need for a change in the structure of the approach of the way that we think about prevention. And there are two parts to this. Obviously, there's what happens when there is a flooding event, and I think there's stuff to be done there, particularly with insurance, but there's also what you've heard so far about what we do to prevent it in the first place. And I told the story of the meeting that we held in Hickling as proof that this can be done, that you can get agencies round the table, you can get them all to recognise the limitations of their individual funds, but rather than spending 6 months trying to dodge the bullet of who's going to pay for this, they actually get to choose who pays for what in a collaborative, fast way and get more done with the same amount of resource. That doesn't mean we don't need more resource. We absolutely do. And one of my calls to government has been, we need to have a funding settlement far, far further ahead than the kind of annual breadcrumb throwing that falls off the table, because that's no good for strategic planning of any agency. But I really wanted to get across in that Westminster Hall debate that this can be done. And I know it can, because the 200 people that came to that meeting in Hickling, still lots of stuff to do, and we're never going to solve the problem completely. But the broad consensus was that it had worked. That approach of joined up working had been successful. So I utterly endorse that on the part of what you've heard this morning, and I'll continue to champion it. I'm also very keen to ensure that the insurance industry plays its part. And again, we have some success to look at here. You will be aware possibly of the Flood Re scheme, the way in which the insurance industry, we as policyholders, whether you know it or not, are already paying a small amount towards insuring the otherwise uninsurable. And I wanted to use this opportunity today to call on government to expand that scheme. It has worked. It's already working, but it doesn't apply to all circumstances. In particular, coastal erosion, which I know is a completely separate topic of discussion, but let's face it, it's not that separate to the issues we're talking about. So I'm calling for an expansion to that scheme today, in particular, the Build Back Better part of the Flood Re scheme. Flood Re takes a small amount from everyone's premium, pulls it into a reinsurance scheme for those that would otherwise struggle to find affordable or even terms offered, which we heard from Alison, premiums. But the Build Back Better thing is a sort of optional extra, but it solves one of the most extraordinary frustrations that I came across as a county councillor. Already been alluded to. Norfolk County Council, the lead flood authority, comes along and writes a report about what should be done to prevent future flooding, and yet there's no money to follow on and actually do it. And there's no mandate to make the insurance company do it either. That's plainly ridiculous. I've got residents who've had the same event in the same place with the same damage 3 times, and each time the insurance company has only put back what was lost. They haven't built back better. And I'm using today's opportunity to call on government to ensure that the Build Back Better part of that scheme is brought into law, and we extend in that regard what's already working. But let's not wait for things to happen. Yes, we shouldn't be allowing it to happen more than once, but let's focus back on the opportunity to be more joined up and to ensure that prevention is the thing which we know delivers the long-term return on investment. And I would leave you with a message of hope. We did get commitments from the minister. We certainly, I think, got understanding. Emma Hardy seems to be a reasonable person. She already confirmed that they are reviewing the flooding formula, a fantastically complex, baffling set of criteria whereby some farmers who have been flooded don't get compensation and others that haven't been flooded do, which is maddening. So there is a real firm commitment already in the next few months to open a consultation on the flooding formula. And I think this just shows what an opportunity there is, again, working cross-party, not just to make our points in various chambers, talk is cheap, but to lobby those that have power, to use the power that we have as elected and employed representatives of our county here to make change. And certainly my takeaway for all my frustrations of Westminster so far is that there is hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph, very much. I've obviously put the fear of God into you all because you're all so on time. But I'm not going to lose that advantage. I'm going to let you go for your break now. And if you can be back here very, very promptly, just before 11:15, because I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Peter Glas has to say from Holland, because they are really the experts in water management, and they've not only drained half Norfolk in the first place, but their landscape is incredibly similar to ours. So I suspect there's really quite a lot we can learn from you, Peter. So don't be late coming back. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the people that have spoken so far. And what I would remind you is when you have finished speaking, switch off your microphone. Thank you, George. So without more ado, we'll have a short break, and please be back here just before 11:15. Thank you.
You want to have a chair in this.
Thank you so much. Now we've got slight technology issues because we were hoping that Peter would be able to just use a clicker, but he's going to just very quietly raise a finger when he wants the next slide. So it's going to be sort of manual, but we need his slides. Peter, I'm sorry that we've got this glitch here. You've come all the way from the Netherlands. I know how hard you've worked on this presentation. You started off by making it an hour long, and I said, no, you can't speak for an hour because otherwise there'll be no time for questions. But I'm very, very grateful, and you're going to speak for half an hour. And I may allow you a tiny bit of leeway because I'm nice. But thank you for coming. You're very, very welcome, and we're very honored that you are here. So we look forward to you sharing your huge wisdom and experience with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. Always a pleasure to be in your company. It's not the first time. So excuse my Dutch. I'll try. If I'm stammering, it's because, well, the mastering of English is not, it's not my first language. Anyhow, you can see the title that I came up with, Water and Flood Management in the Netherlands, about paradigm shifts and multi-level governance. I think a lot of that was also already covered in the presentations before the break. And so now I raise my finger. This is about the Netherlands, indeed, a delta. And here we are, there we are, and we share the North Sea, obviously. And if you look at the map, you can see that the Netherlands is actually at the confluence of major European rivers, and that's slightly different from where we are today. Next, if you tilt it a bit, you can see we're actually connected to the Alps. And again, the total catchment is 800,000 kilometers, and which is 19 times the surface area of the country. So we are next the drain of Europe. In more than one respect, I would say. Next. So we have a history of water and land management. If you take a map, no, well, that was yeah, it's like being in an auction, isn't it? Sold. Anyhow, so 500 years ago, there was more water than land, I suppose, just north from Amsterdam, the province of North Holland. And then in the 16th, 17th century, we started draining that water and reclaiming land, very fertile land. And if you now look from space, you see quite a different map, if you will, of our country. So that was the, yeah, that was. So it's a man-made country, but still almost 90% is surface water. 25%, everything dark blue, is below sea level. And I looked it up, what that is, ChatGPT did, and apparently, no, I'm too quick. Shall we, I do it this way. That's better than one finger, yes? To make it, yeah. So if I move, it's nothing. Anyhow, so 0.6% apparently in the UK. 69%, everything dark and light blue and purple is the Meuse Valley in the south, is prone to flooding from the sea, occasionally from the sea or the main rivers, or permanently below sea level. And apparently in the UK, that's a little over 10%, almost 11. So 17 million inhabitants live in the Netherlands. 11 million are protected by big dikes. And we live behind the dikes. 2/3 of our gross national product is earned behind the dikes. And the cost of water management, everything together. So that's drinking water, sewerage, irrigation, drainage, the delta works, the ports and harbors, everything together. The cost is 9.2 billion euros, latest figure, but that is less than 1% of GDP. So for that insurance premium, if you will, for those investment and maintenance, I should add. I mean, maintenance is the big word. The M word today is very important. And I agree fully. And the GDP of the Netherlands is just over €1 trillion currently. So next, yes. So a man-made country indeed. And these are just some of the, let's say, assets that we maintain and we constantly invest in. And you can see the impressive figures, if you ask me. The primary flood defenses is 3,500 kilometers along the coastline, the Lake IJssel in the middle, but then we have 14,000 of secondary, smaller dikes and levees, etc. Well, you can see the water courses, sewage pipes, and drinking water mains, and the polders. You know what a polder is, with a circular dike around it, the pumping stations, etc., etc. So it is indeed underscoring this is a man-made country. Next. Nevertheless, we protect it, but we've had our share of floodings, 1,000 years of recorded floodings, and just over the past century and this century, early years of this century, from the sea, from the rivers, and torrential rain, and even from the subsurface seeping saline water in some parts of the country. So it comes from 4 dimensions. From the sea, we had devastating storm surges, and today and tomorrow we are commemorating the storm surge from 1953, which lives were lost. Also here and in the Netherlands, more than 1,800 people. And tomorrow there will be a big ceremony. Every year this is commemorated. And the last post is there, the national anthem and flags half-mast. From the rivers, 26, but more recently, also on the 1st of February, so tomorrow in 1995, 300,000 people were evacuated. And the dikes held. So with hindsight, it was not necessary, but it was a narrow escape. Well, I will talk a bit more about that. And then more recently, in 2021, we have called it, well, our Flanders friends have called it the water bomb. And that is also in my next slide, water bombs, like you have here. Next. So this was July in the summer, more rain in the winter, but also in summer. So it is erratic almost, unpredictable, or hard to predict anyhow. So this was this rain complex over the Eifel, the Ardennes, and the southern part of the Netherlands. 25 centimeters of rain in 2 days. Next. And with devastating effect. I mean, some parts just collapsed. Next. This is a town I visited a year later, Bad Neuenahr. It's a very nice, picturesque German town. The rubble had gone a year later, but all of the businesses were still boarded up. So the disruption goes on for quite some time. Next. But I should have mentioned earlier, first, 220 dead. And we didn't expect that was possible anymore after 53. So many lives lost. And this was in Germany and in Belgium. Luckily, no lives lost in the Netherlands, but the damage was also 2 days of rain, 40 billion euros in damage. And these are the data from the insurance companies. 400 million damage in Netherlands. So relatively speaking, we got away cheaper. But it is very impactful. Next slide. But it happened again. The question then was, how exceptional is this kind of summer rain? Well, it turns out it is not that exceptional anymore. The statistics are changing, and we're witnessing this. So it is in Dutch, but apocalyptic, you can read, and 25 dead again in Central Europe. The damage approaching 4 billion. Next. And a similar rain system there, which stayed in its place for more than 2 days. Next is Spain. Again, 220 people died in Valencia. And damage 10 billion. And to the left is the sort of new year paper of a national newspaper, the year in pictures. And this was the front page of what happened in Spain in the Dutch national newspaper, the front page. Next. So data are very important. Data, and internationally, this is carried out by the IPCC. I'm sure you're familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What is happening? What is the physical science basis behind it? Next. And then translates that into impacts, adaptation options, and what are the vulnerabilities next, and translate that in synthesis, reports, summaries for policymakers, because we need action. And in the Netherlands, the Royal Meteorological Institute then comes up with climate scenarios. So looking into the future, how will the statistics change with flooding, with sea level rise, with rain, drought, fires, etc. Next. And that is very much called for because the economic damage, according to the European Environment Agency, is now well over 40 billion euros annually in the EU. UK figures are not included here anymore, but I'm sure they're somewhere. There was talk of how to prevent, because this is on the table and this is real damage in communities, etc. Next. And by the way, I know globally the damage is now $350 billion, $350 billion annually. So that is a case for prevention, isn't it? For climate adaptation as well as mitigation. So the Dutch response in recent years, the 1916 flood, which hit this, what we then called the Southern Sea, a branch of the North Sea in the center of the country. And the motto or the philosophy was to shorten the coastline. And we did by building this great big dam, which you can see from space. And it closed off, but it needed this disaster because it had been on the drawing board for a century already to close this off. And now it happened. Go back, please. What you could see, this central lake is now our biggest freshwater reservoir. And it's so important for agriculture, for drinking water. We cannot do without it anymore. So indeed, the next one was after 53. The Delta Plan, again, shortening the shoreline of the Netherlands. You could see closing off these branches of the estuary. Well, closing off, some of them are open, closable barriers. So, I mean, civil engineering wonders almost. The Eastern Scheldt, open because of ecological reasons. The ecology of the Eastern Scheldt with clams and oysters and other the ecology is now maintained because it is open. The Maasland barrier near the port of Rotterdam protects and you see the two wide arms. Both of them are as big as the Eiffel Tower. So these are two Eiffel Towers protecting the port and the hinterland. Normally they are open. And they are open for economic reasons. The port of Rotterdam, their unique selling point, we are an open access port, no sluices or whatever. Next. So after the events of 1993 and 1995, again a paradigm shift to giving more room to the river. We had confined the major rivers in ever closer area, building up the dikes higher and higher to allow for the flow of the water, and then we came to realize we have to reinstate or reconstruct the floodplains where we can, and we did in 31 places along. It's too small to watch, but you could see the dots there along these branches of the Rhine River. And if you travel around, you can see the pictures like on the left, the artist impression here. And there was a twofold objective: to improve safety after perhaps neglect of maintenance of our major river dikes. So to improve on that, as well as developing nature, reconstructing nature, if you will. It's man-made, as I said. Next. And that is on the largest scale. This is a 10-minute bike ride from where I live. It used to be the meandering little river there. Then in the 60s, this was a canal. And now we've dug up the old meanders again. So now we have the best of both. And at high floods, we use the canal as a safety valve, if you will. But normally it goes through the meanders, allowing also the water to seep into the aquifers and the deep groundwater, which is a problem in dry summers. Next. So some examples of how these paradigms or these principles have developed. The sand motor, and I'm sure you are familiar with that sandscaping project, which was, if I'm informed correctly, inspired by this one, which we in the Netherlands call the sand motor. It's a big depot, and the tidal movement, the currents and the wind move the sand along the coastline, strengthening these sandy beaches. Next. This is an experimental example of also building with nature. This is to the far northeast on the Ems estuary, a river we share with Germany, and it is silting up very much, this estuary. There's a lot of silt there, and they've now pumped the silt into these depots that you see at to the left of the dike. And there it settles, and the water is drained, and after 3 years of ripening, you have perfect clay to build up the dike where necessary. Instead of getting clay from the river branches, so use that, you build you have your own building material. So it's an example also of circular thinking. Next is my personal favorite. I'm a biologist, and I got lost in water management. I'm a biologist by trade and a lawyer, but that's a different matter. So to the left, you have a classical dikes, like it would be up north, with sheep on the dike, maybe 4 species of grass, and that maintenance is by sheep, and it's perfect, and it doesn't erode under normal circumstances. To the right, the idea was, could we have more biodiversity and have a multitude of flowering herbs there, attracting bees and birds and et cetera, but is it safe? So we did all kinds of experiments. I mean, real physical experiments, throwing loads of water over the dike in experimental setups, and it proved it was just as safe. So now we have a choice to go for the classical dike or have what I call the flower power dike. So I like the flower power dike. Anyhow, next. The Delta program. I was Delta Commissioner, which is an independent government commissioner. I was appointed the second in that position. Now we have the third because, as it says, I am recently retired. Rub it in. Anyhow, so next. So there was a Delta committee, the second in 2007, and the question on the table was existential. Can we remain to live in this Delta? That's quite a question, isn't it? Or should we retire and speak German or French or whatever? Anyhow, the answer after 1 year is yes, we can, providing we take a proactive stance. We take proactive measures, not wait for the disaster to happen and then reconstruct, build back, perhaps build back better. But that was, for centuries, the case. Now, look forward. Be aware, prevention comes first, and invest in climate adaptation as well as mitigation. But mitigation is a global challenge, isn't it? But the adaptation, that's our agenda. With a long-term view, prepare for the worst and mitigate the effects once they happen. Next. Yes, and with the target then of 2050, since then we've moved the target to 2100 and beyond. Please, yes. So some recommendations, I won't go into detail, but it is about safety standards for the design of our flood defenses, taking into account the risk of drowning and economic damage once it happens, maintain the sandy coastline, so we will maintain our position there, maintain the strategic freshwater supply, invest in resilient adaptive spatial planning, inner cities, etc., but also in the rural areas, and provide national multi-level coordination. So governance is key if you want to organize it. And that is all now codified in the so-called Delta Law of 2012. So there's a legal codification. There is an annual Delta program presented by the opening of Parliament to Parliament every year. An independent Delta commissioner, I was the second in that position, and a Delta fund. Looking forward also, if you need forward-looking measures and scenarios, then you need the money to cover that. And so part of the 9 billion that I mentioned before is the Delta fund, which is annually added with about 2 billion currently, with a horizon of 14 years, which is important for policy development, for planning of measures to be taken, but also for the industry. They know that this money is, well, virtually in the bank. It's there to be spent and we know what we want to do with it. Next. So it is a national Delta program, and with the underscored national, so it involves national government as all branches, as well as all branches of regional and local government. There is a Delta Program Commissioner for coordination, independent, so not under the minister, but next to the minister, if you will, businesses, research institutes, and ultimately, I mean, the people that live there where things happen and have to be involved in public participation schemes. A lot of those carried out by our water boards. And I think that's on the next slide. If not, it's, well, yeah, it is multi-level governance, and that is key. Next, please. So what is multi-level governance in our situation? Next. So here we have the main setup, European Union, still relevant where I live, national government. Poker face. The Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management, but also for housing and et cetera, the Delta Commissioner as part of a national structure, and the National Water Agency, which we call Rijkswaterstaat, was established by Napoleon, by the way, in 1798. So older than the Kingdom of the Netherlands is the National Water Agency. But then the water boards, 21 present, are even older than that, 800 years. And after the 53 disaster, there were 2,600 water boards, tiny little water boards. And they've merged because of efficiency arguments. And now we have 21. And they have their own taxation mandate. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is so important. And no taxation without representation. So there are elected water boards. There are general elections along with the provincial. So you have your county elections together with a separate ballot sheet for your local water board, along political party lines again, but also with representation of farmers, of businesses, of household owners, and the rest of us. So 4 categories there. So the municipalities, the water boards, and 10 public drinking water companies. They're not private, they're publicly owned companies. Next, I won't tell you about all the different mandates, and it is complicated here, but it is complicated in the Netherlands. But nevertheless, it seems to work to a certain extent, anyhow. Next. So the Delta program, every year, as I said, presented to Parliament, contains 3 Delta plans. Next. 1 on flood protection. Current figure is that we have to still invest in 1,400 kilometers of dikes out of the 3,500. And when it started, it was about 60%, and some of them have been carried out. So they're completed. So the current figure is 1,400 kilometers. There's an annual part of the Delta budget, or the Delta fund was 400 million plus inflation. It's about 500 million now, and it is co-funded by central government, 50-50, with the joint water boards. So the water boards collectively collect about 250 million every year. And there's a complicated formula to come to that figure, depending on inhabitants and surface area, et cetera, but nevertheless, and then it is transferred to the Ministry of Finance and then to the Ministry of Infrastructure. 50-50. So it's co-production, and you can see the map with the pins there. Every year a plan is produced, and so the projects, you can look it up where in which stage of development or completion they are. Next is the second Delta plan on freshwater availability. We've had 4 almost consecutive years of drought. So a stimulus program was derived, first stage of that, and we're now in the second phase of that, more than €1 billion. And again, with co-funding, but now it is not 50-50, but it is 30%, 70%. 70% is regional funding. And for that, the taxation mandate of the water boards is very important. They can charge in their own area. And to the right, there I am with the then minister opening one of those projects, which was funded from this stimulus program. And the third next is the Delta Plan on spatial adaptation in inner cities to prevent things that we heard earlier, waterlogging, but also heat stress, flooding of local watercourses, smaller rivers, and drought. 800 million there, but you may have noticed the end is approaching 2028. A decision has to be reached if that would be continued, but that is a political debate which has not been resolved yet. But yet again, it is co-funding. So you get €1 from The Hague, in our case, the capital, but you have to put your own money on the table. And I'm very much in favor of such a design because it underlines the national program that it is, but it also the responsibility of local authorities, municipalities, water boards, provincial authorities, together with industries and homeowners, etc., is reflected in this co-funding arrangement. Next, please. So this is just sort of this is new to get green, blue infrastructure in inner cities, existing cities, but also new developments, how to do this. And this is pretty much learning by doing. And there are many, many very nice examples, but also failures, and we share that. So the Delta program is also a Delta community. You are now 120 thereabouts. Annually, we convene a Delta conference of 1,500 people attending from all lines of public administration, but the science, banks, insurance companies, building companies, they all gather around the theme of climate adaptation. Next. So sea level rise is of particular interest here, as it is in the Netherlands, obviously. Next is the graph you may be familiar with that comes from the IPCC. And the range, this runs to 2150, but the range for 2100, the end of this century, would be in the order of maybe 30 centimeters if we limit the, let's say, the emission of greenhouse gases, but it could be up to 1 meter or even higher. And if the Antarctics become unstable, we reach a tipping point there and it goes out of hand, it may be 2 meters. So the pace of the change is the limiting factor of our response. That is something to realize. The pace is so high that you need to look ahead and work with scenarios. And I'll go through, yes, please, and the next. 4 scenarios are now, and the next, please. 4 scenarios are now, again, yeah, there's the first. So the drawing board is being drawn now, and we have these are cartoons illustrating what this, let's say, the more extremes might be. So build a big wall. Well, there's somebody else who wants to build a big wall. I don't think that includes pumping stations. No, probably not. Probably not. But we need pumping stations to do that. And then the Netherlands, the Delta would be basically one big polder. But think of cybersecurity and the pumping stations. I don't know. But these are things to consider, at least. And get your calculus, do the design. And we're in the process of doing that. And the next is a different approach. That is more or less what we do now, to protect but maintain an open connection. So water can flow out and tide can come in. And with ever higher sea level, the tide enters into the country way past, let's say, the middle of the country even. But you have to build up your dikes or your dunes, and the Delta works, and ever higher dikes along the rivers, or more space. So it will be very impactful anyhow. The third is in the tradition of new land, build a string of islands. We've done so in Dubai. Why don't we do that in the North Sea? Have a string of islands connected. You have new land. You have a new freshwater reservoir, which could be interesting. And you need pumps, less big, but still you need pumps. And you can see this is a major investment. One of those islands was calculated to cost 100 billion. So, but it can be done. Technically, it can be done. Do we want this? That's a different question. The fourth is the most extreme in the Dutch culture, retreat. Well, accommodate, euphemistically. But it is retreat and have a new coastline. And part of the population perhaps speaks German by that time. And some of the UNESCO heritage sites of Amsterdam and Delft and what have you, protect that with a separate dike. So none of this will actually happen in the form of the cartoons. That is clear, I hope. But it defines the corners of the drawing board. And we are really very actively looking at this. And if you ask me, and I'm independent, recently retired, we should reach a decision within, well, maybe this decade. So maybe what not to do. And then look forward how we may approach this. Next. In any case, no climate adaptation without mitigation, because if it goes out of hand with the warming of the atmosphere and the oceans, then this also is not to be reached practically, realistically. So again, next. In conclusion, next. I talked about paradigm shifts, and over the period, I've been in water management in my country for more than 40 years now. So next. Before 53, it was actually waiting till the next disaster. And then you get up again, you get knocked down, you get up again, reconstruct step-by-step response. Next is the first Delta plan, was a civil engineering at the core fight against water. Remember, this was just after the Second World War. So it was in military terms. We will fight the forces of nature and we will prevail. We will win this. Next. Not in this presentation, but very important, is too much water, too little water, too polluted water. So law against water pollution was very important, as in 72, next, the Club of Rome, the realization that there are limits to growth. That was more than 50 years ago, 72. I bought that booklet. It's always on my desk. I was 16 at the time, so you can do the calculus. Recently retired. Next, the paradigm shift towards more integrated water management, the systems approach that was mentioned earlier in the 80s. And in the 90s, next, the paradigm shift to room for the river, room for water, not fighting the water, but living with water, but not at the expense of safety. That much is also clear. We need the safety, but we have to live with water. Next slide. Again, please. So the Framework Directive of 2000 is about protection and restoration of aquatic ecology, water quality, and natural morphology. Next. And then 2010, the paradigm shift from mostly civil engineering to nature-based solutions, the sandscape and what we see now, the re-meandering of rivers, etc., blue and green in inner cities. Those are all examples of nature-based solutions. And most recently, water and soil as the prime conditioning factor for any building activity or construction. Water and soil are leading. Next is the Delta program. And that is the combination for many of these aspects, not water quality or ecology, but the more physical elements there with the Delta Fund, the long-term perspective, proactive climate adaptation, flood protection, freshwater resources. You can read the infrastructure, housing, and public spaces. So all of that together under one umbrella. And with that, I think the next, lessons learned. What are the lessons learned? Please, yes. If we work against the forces of nature, we will lose eventually. That's my conviction, and you see the signs now. We will lose our way of living. Next. Prevention is cheaper, 1 to 14, I heard today, than mending damage done. Next. Nature is an inspiration, talking as a biologist here, and it has been a working lab for billions, for eons. And so get your inspiration from how nature solves things and then translate that into civil engineering, because you need the construction industry there. but they are changing very much. Next, and we need, it's a full sentence, adaptive, incremental, scalable water management solutions. They have to be both resilient today and sustainable into the future in face of not only climate change, but also demographic changes and growing uncertainties of all nature about the future. Next, I think that's the final one. So effective water management and flood management is an exercise in multi-level governance anyhow. National, regional, local, public and private. We need a legal codification. That was very important. They can't get rid of this scheme because it's in the law. And a mechanism for co-creation through all that levels, and then co-funding at all levels. And I think that concludes the presentation. Is it? Yes, I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very inspiring and fruitful conference, obviously. It's a summit.
Wow. Recently retired, eh? Peter,
I didn't catch that.
Peter, thank you so much. That was very thought-provoking, and your experience, I feel, is going to be hugely important to us too. So thank you. Now this brings us on to our next part, which is, in a sense, one of the most important parts of this, which is the questions and how we're going to deal with some of these things. Peter, you're not on the panel, but please feel free to answer anything, because you might have some interesting things. Now, I'm not going to introduce the panel. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, because that'll save time. Kay, can we start with you, please?
Yes, hello. I'm Councillor Kay Mason-Billig, and I'm the leader of Norfolk County Council.
Hi, I'm Daniel Johns. I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Innes Thompson, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Association of Drainage Authorities, ADA.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Russon. I'm a National Director at the Environment Agency.
Good morning. My name is Robin Price, and I'm the Director of Quality and Environment at Anglian Water.
Good morning. I'm Laura Lutkowski. I'm Deputy Director of Floods Policy in DEFRA.
So you got some pretty high-powered people there. And now is your opportunity to ask questions. So who is going to ask the first question? Yes, sir. I can't read your name, but I can see CLA, Country Landowners Association.
Thank you. Nick Sanford from the CLA. I was very inspired by the phrase learn by doing. And one of the areas that I'd be interested to hear the panel's view on is natural flood management. There's been a lot of talk about it, and obviously there's opportunities now, especially with the environmental land management scheme, to progress this, but it seems to be very slow. And I know certainly in the area where we live, the headwaters of the Burn, there's opportunities there for some natural flood management schemes. And I would like to ask the panel how much they think the implementation of natural flood management schemes is an important tool in this whole issue of both flooding, but also retaining water for when it's needed in the summer.
Laura, do you want to take that one first?
So I can definitely give you the sort of the DEFRA position on that. So Minister Hardy, when she came in, I think in quite literally the first session which she had with her, was really interested in natural flood management and how we can do more at the national level to enable those schemes to go ahead. Also understanding that natural flood management is important for so many more things other than just flood prevention. You need to consider all of those benefits that they can bring, as you say. So one of the things that we will be doing is, and Minister Hardy launched this just before Christmas, we're going to launch consultation this spring, which will look at a whole range of stuff around investment. But one of the things it will do is re-examine how we prioritise the national funding. What are the rules around that to try and enable more natural flood management schemes to go ahead through the Environment Agency's floods programme. The other thing we do is we do work really closely with colleagues in DEFRA who deliver the Farming and Countryside programme through the ELM scheme, and how we can better understand the flood mitigation actions that are in there as well. So that's what we're doing at the national level. I'm sure others will have view on the local practitioner level.
Thanks, Laura. Daniel?
Well, just to introduce Water Resources East, first of all, and you're probably thinking, why is a water resources guy at a flood risk management conference? You know, it is related because the answer in many cases is to think more holistically, think in a systems way, to join the dots, and yeah, to create more integrated water management plans for our catchments, as we were just hearing about, you know, why it's so important. And nature-based solutions is a really key tool in that arsenal. It's not going to replace the need for kind of grey engineered solutions, you know, drainage, maintenance of existing schemes, more investment in capital programs, but it is a complementary scheme, and we are helping through developing a Norfolk Water Fund. So this is the kind of a project that we've got with Anglian Water, Norfolk County Council, and the Nature Conservancy. And you're sitting next to Ed Bramman-Jones, who yesterday, through the Norfolk Rivers Trust, the Environment Agency announced our very first scheme that we have funded alongside the Environment Agency and other funders on the River Yare to reconnect the floodplain. And why are we funding a floodplain reconnection scheme? Because we think it will deliver benefits of water quality and water resources. And alongside that, also thinking about how our strategic reservoir options can help with flood risk management by thinking about water in a more integrated way, in partnership with the internal drainage boards. And we're also investing in a smart farming trial in Cambridgeshire. But if it works in Cambridgeshire, it could be rolled out more regularly, which is about how can we make more use of the water in the landscape by bringing in more water storage for agriculture, for irrigation, but also by taking water when the flows are high, in order to be able to manage situations when the flows are low. So we are absolutely up for this game. We're working very closely, say, with councils, with the regional flood and coastal committees on the natural flood management measures, with the water companies as board members. And we think there's a lot we can achieve together by working more closely in partnership.
Anybody else on the panel want to pick that up? Yes, John.
I really like Peter's phrase, a biologist lost in flood risk management, because I am too, Peter. So I'm an absolute advocate for natural flood management measures. As you may know, the Environment Agency, with additional funding from DEFRA, have been running some pilots, about £40 million worth of natural flood management schemes we've been running, which are generating an awful lot of learning. But as Laura said, what we're hoping to do in the next investment period from next April is that the funding rules will make it much easier to mainstream natural flood management. So I'm really optimistic that we'll see a lot more of it across our landscape, helping us mitigate flood risk.
Robin, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. So I mentioned, so from an Anglian Water perspective, we have just had our business plan approved. So we will be investing £11 billion in our region between 2025 and 2030. And a massive chunk of that money is around, firstly, bringing significant ecological improvement to catchments, but also working to make the East of England more resilient to drought and flooding. So joining this up. And we've built our business plan taking a nature first approach. So we've absolutely gone with the, back to another third biologist on the panel here. Nature is an absolute inspiration. I've just remembered in front of my book, I've got a poster note with the list of all of the different nature-based solutions that we are looking at. And it is the things you think around treatment wetlands. It's about river morphology, slowing the flow, trees. But it's also things like improving soil carbon, because, the more carbon there is in soil, carbon heavy soil holds more water. So there are, myriad of kind of links that we can join between the water industry, between the agricultural community and within our communities. And all of those are fairly rural sounding. We can't forget our towns and cities as well. So we've also got to think around how we make our towns and cities more permeable. So rain doesn't bounce, land bounce and then end up in the wrong pipe and end up in somebody's home, very, very unfortunately. So how do we create more sustainable urban drainage systems? How do we look at rain gardens, suds, planters, all this sort of things, rain gardens, etc. So there's a whole portfolio of kind of options that we're looking at, none of which we can do as Anglian Water on our own. We are reliant on everybody in this room and beyond as we move forward on this. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Nick. Matthew Philpott, you wanted to ask a question.
Yep, thank you. So Matthew Philpott, Chief Operating Officer at the Water Management Alliance, representing internal drainage boards around the county. Firstly, thank you for such a really amazing conference. I think it's been very interesting, and it's good to see the MPs here as well to hear these things firsthand. When Alan Lovell visited us last year, he was very supportive of starting a process for demaining certain low-risk main rivers across the county, and I believe that would be one element of the process of giving more power to IDBs and to districts to do work in the right locations, where the right partners are there, where the right conditions are in place. I wonder whether the panel also would support restarting a process to agree how we do that within Norfolk.
John, do you want to start off on that one?
I can do. Hi, Matthew. Good to see you. It won't surprise you to know I absolutely agree with our chair. And I think we should look at demaining. In many ways, there's nothing to stop it happening. The Environment Agency are always really willing to work in partnership to do that. We do know, though, whether for good or not reasons, it's quite a complex process. There's a lot of legislation around this. It does, of course, need real partnership working to have willing partners to take on some of those accountabilities from the Environment Agency, but also may need some investment of money so that the assets are in a good position. Following the Somerset floods, and it's great to be in Norfolk, by the way. I live on the edge of the Somerset level, so lots of very similar issues and similar landscapes, so lots of echoes of home for me here. We did run 3 pilots. I think there's 2 in Lincolnshire and 1 in Kent. The pilots themselves have been successful. I think the challenge then is taking that learning from the pilots and seeing what we can do to enact that more widely. And that might involve trying to make the process a lot simpler so it can happen more quickly and more smoothly. But absolutely, I've got some fantastic local colleagues over in East Anglia, and I know that they'd be happy to conversations about demaining with partners.
I'm sure he'll hold you to it. Kay.
Yes, thank you. I used to sit on an IDB, and it's full of incredibly knowledgeable people who know exactly about their area, what works and what doesn't work. And I've been out there in my wellies, sort of peering into pumping stations and things like that. It's fascinating to see how the network fits together. I think one of the problems that we have is that we are quite diverse in local government. So the IDB levies up to district council, and so it goes on. And perhaps when we're looking at local government reorganisation, we can look at a bit more streamlining and some efficiencies that we can also put into the system, because there are different IDBs. They work in slightly different ways, but perhaps we need to come together more often and streamline some of our processes so that we can actually work together collectively for the whole of the area that we serve.
Thank you, Kay. Laura, were you waving at me or not? Not. Ines, you tried to come on that. Yeah.
May I just add in that actually significant progress is being made, and it's thanks to some really hard work that's going on behind the scenes with our colleagues at DEFRA. And I'm sure, hopefully I'm not preempting here, Laura, but there is a little bit of legislation. It's very technical. It's very, it really is quite techy, but it is basically going to permit, it's a piece of enabling legislation that will permit drainage boards to potentially expand their boundaries with local support. And I really stress that. So once the legislation is in place, it will be a choice. So it will not be mandatory, but that tool will be in the toolbox for local drainage boards to be able to work with their local partners and say, we've got that piece of legislation in place. Shall we have a think about possibly taking over stretches of watercourses that are currently outside our districts? And what I would say to you is, and we've mentioned it several times this morning, the collaboration is going to be the key aspect of it. There is unanimous local support for this. It will happen. And finally, there is a worry about process. And, you know, I was right front and fore when we went through the pilots and understanding just how much process was involved in those pilots. It had to be done because we had to see the full extent of what it looked like to demain. But the challenge I will put back to John and to others is, if you look at how the highways departments deal with the transfer of assets, I do believe it's 2 men or women are in a room with a piece of paper each and a pen in hand and maybe a pound coin, and there you go, can I transfer that asset across to you, please? I'm over exaggerating here, but surely there is a mechanics of government process that can be brought to bear that basically says, let's just make this a very simple signature on a piece of paper that says from Environment Agency to local authority or internal drainage board, we pass over this watercourse.
Keep it simple, eh? Daniel.
Just to add that we also support internal drainage boards having greater powers, more funding to look at water in a more integrated way. So many IDBs are already doing this. They're already thinking about how we can, again, if more water storage in the landscape is the answer to both drought and flood risk management, IDBs ideally located with those skills, expertise, understanding, institutional knowledge about how to manage catchments better for both those objectives. We have to stop kind of, allowing ourselves to be ploughing in particular silos, need to break across these different boundaries. But the IDBs do need powers, and need to have the license to be able to think in that way, and need to have the funding to be able to kind of to act in that way.
Thank you. Professor Tim O'Riordan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and what a wonderful presentation from everyone. I have the advantage of being very connected to the science community around climate change. And that community is coming up with some new work, which is not yet published, but will be published next week. And it is showing that the rate of climate change and global warming is much greater than we thought it would be. And in fact, it's more likely to be reinforced by climate change, creating new climate change. So Peter, your 4 wonderful items need a 5th, which is called imagination. We need to be able to imagine beyond the normal. I'm sorry, Henry, the new normal is not the phrase. We're constantly going to be behind the ball. We're running always to catch a train which is going further and further away from us. So it's not about adaptation, it's about anticipating adaptation. And we have no tools for that. So my first point to you is we need a new way of dealing with imagination and with anticipation than we've ever done before. In 10 years' time, the highest temperature of the year, the highest hot temperature was 1924. In 10 years' time, it'll be the 4th highest. There'll be 3 highs before 1935. So that's the kind of situation we're in. History is being created as every single day. So my first point is we need to, what Peter was talking about, get the local communities mobilized. I'm working with the Council Protection Bureau of England to get a toolkit for all parishes in Norfolk. Every parish should be eyes and ears of where the next flooding will be. What Alison suffered is going to be commonplace around Norfolk. We need every parish to be actively involved and supported by water resources, by you guys, not just in terms, by the way, of flooding, but the other half of this coin is drought. Because actually the climate models are going to show that drought is much more likely to be serious in Northern Europe than it's ever been before. And again, history is being created year by year. So mobilize the parishes. George, your setup is really important in that area. Number 2, maximize the new 2 schemes coming from government. One is Nature Recovery Network, or Nature Recovery Fund, and the other one is the idea of a new land use strategy. It's very important that we put these 2 ideas into every aspect of land use management. So as Peter was saying, the land and the rivers and the seas and the marshes and the ponds become our friends and become our new neighbors. They're going to have to enhance them and change them directly. So the real plea for me is not about any longer flooding. It's about the totality of how we live in relation to the landscape. And bear in mind my words, whatever is now will be history in 10 years' time.
Thank you, Tim. What a challenging point. Peter, how much imagination have you got in the Netherlands?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've had a history of sort of gradually getting to grips with the forces of nature and understanding and step by step changing. And now the paradigm has shifted that we have to look forward. That was a major step policy-wise, but also for the daily practice. And you go from transition to transformation, and it can be disruptive. And indeed, the worst imaginable flood or the worst imaginable drought. And what would then be your response? And we're sort of trying to do that with the science community in the Netherlands, also to have gaming exercises there to see what might happen and what may be our response. And indeed, to try to live with these new challenges rather than negate or push back or think that it will pass. It will not pass. It will happen. And if not our lifetime, then the next generation and the generation after that. So I couldn't agree more. And well, I showed you some cartoons. That is part of the imagination, I suppose. And the fifth, so the fifth is there, I suppose. Awareness is also very important. So I couldn't be, this was the darlings I had to kill because of Henry, but that we have public access here. Anyone in the Netherlands can go to a site, and it is the climate adaptation site, .nl in the Netherlands, and you can look up your own zip code, your own street, and in 63 parameters, you can see what the vulnerabilities are of that particular site, how high the water would come, what the heat stress would be on a summer's night. And so I go around to Rotary clubs and what have you and present that, and hardly anybody knows. So awareness is also a vulnerability, or the lack of awareness, and we should invest in that and make it available publicly. And so all those data are there. So this is what I can say at this point. But I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Peter. Kay.
Yes, I mean, as the county council, we are the lead local flood authority, which means we have no power and no money, but we are responsible, which is situation normal in local government. But one thing we can do is we can convene with our parish councils, and I know all of our parishes have been invited to watch this summit today. And a toolkit for parishes is certainly something that we can help with. So it's a practical solution, an on the ground solution, because local people have got lived knowledge. They know how their watercourses operate, and they know where the problems are. Alison talked about that earlier in Long Stratton. There's a lot of local knowledge that we're not tapping into. So not just asking our local parishes to almost give us the data as it happens, because that's something we definitely need. And George talked earlier about meteorological information that we're not taking advantage of. We have lots of information on the ground here in Norfolk, and we need to gather that together. And then also, how do we get that out to our parishioners? How do we make them understand the measures they themselves can take in order to prevent flooding, or when it happens, to actually try to prevent some of the damage that comes with it? So things like not tipping your grass cuttings into the ditch that's behind your house because you don't think it's never got any water in it. Then the one time it does have water in it, you then find that overtops and it's in your house. There are very small things that we can do, but may make a very large difference. So I'm not an expert on climate change. I wouldn't profess to be as eminent as these people sitting along here. But in terms of practicalities and what we can do as a council, then yes, we'll certainly be on board to help if we can.
Laura, are you leading the way with this in government and your agency? Seems to me you've got quite a lot of responsibility.
I won't profess to be leading the way. I was going to make a couple of comments. So one of the things that we're trying to think about in my team is if you moving away from what's the role of government and building big flood defences, maintaining the ones we've got, how can you help people to live with water more effectively? And there's a couple of angles to that. One is around the insurance angle and the role of the insurance industry, and that came earlier in some of the comments. So Build Back Better is a really good example where the insurance industry can be helping people to do more. I think about 60 to 70% of the industry offer that anymore. How can we increase that so 100% of the insurance industry offers it? There's a lot around the education space and property flood resilience measures, so that there's a role for government there, definitely, in educating, communicating. It's also relevant to the work on the flood formula consultation. I think 90% of property flood resilience measures are delivered through the Environment Agency. It's a really important tool in the box to help people live with that. We also need to work with MHCLG. If we're building 1.5 million more homes, how do you do that in a way that's resilient in the future? And that can be really simple things like don't put your plugs on the floor. Really simple things that should be implementable. I was also going to point to, I don't know if you've seen it already, there's a consultation launched this morning on land use, which I would encourage anyone with an interest in that to have a bit of a Google on.
Thank you. Now Peter wants to throw a stone in the pond.
I'm Dutch, you can ship me off. Funding and how to bring together local knowledge, responsibility, the innovation, the impulse to change, to get things done, and how to finance that, how to fund it. And it is interesting, and I learned this only well into my career, that almost everything in Holland is funded from the central budget. Defense, education, health, you name it, and it is almost everything is central budget. There's very little local taxation, with the one exception, that is water management. Everything connected to water, 85% of the capital investment and maintenance is covered by local taxes, tariffs, and from the water companies, from the water boards with their own taxation, the provinces, etc., etc. So it's interesting to and this is not a blueprint, but to rethink where lies the responsibility, who is hit the hardest, and where is the impulse, and to connect that with the ability to fund it. I think this is something that really needs to be also on the drawing board, besides all the technical issues, etc., etc. It's just a thought that I want to leave with you. So maybe redesign the finance of all of this.
Something for your bill, George. Something for your bill, George. Now, are there any other questions on this topic that Professor O'Riordan's raised? Yes, Jan Davis.
Yes, thank you very much, Henry. I mean, the points that Tim made are very, very clear, very stark, and we do need to take into account that. It was interesting what Peter said about can we stay in times of climate change? It's a key question, and I think some people are aware, very much aware of the risks that we're running. Many other people aren't, and we've talked about that in terms of raising awareness. I do chair the elected members forum of the Broadland Futures Initiative, which is looking at the next 100 years. So it's a 7-year program looking at, working with, obviously supported by the Environment Agency and Broads Authority and local councils. And a key question is, and we're getting to the point of being able to then communicate what it is that we're up against, but how do we do that in a sensitive way, which ensures that we have joined up messages. So we have a variety of different organizations and we all have our different communications protocols and so on. But it'd be interesting to know how we might more effectively communicate the risks that we're at. And that I suppose it's a plea to say, well, really do need to work together on communications, bearing in mind how sensitive it is, given what is coming along.
Thank you. Ines, you want to pick that up?
Just a very quick experience which I was part of. John will probably be highly aware of this, but down in Somerset when they had the really bad flooding, there was an action and reaction to that. The long and the short of it is that there was a decision taken that the local councils would add 1.5% onto their council tax bills across the county, county-wide. So it didn't matter whether you lived up on the top of the hill or down in the right at the end of the watercourse before it went out to sea. And at the time, all the tabloid papers, all the newspapers, all the media lined up with a great big headline saying additional local taxation on local people. Is this not a terrible piece of news, etc., etc.? Most of the people in Somerset turned around and said, we're actually prepared to put a little bit of extra money on the table if it's going to mean that we get some local say and some local planning around what this means. The quantum of money involved here comes to around about between £2.5 and £3 million a year. And I'm pleased to say that since the event happened in Somerset, each year there's something called a notional settlement is agreed to by HM Treasury, and they have rolled that over year on year. And I also believe it's been rolled over from Parliament to Parliament. So they continue to raise that money with the blessing of the local people involved.
Thank you. James Wild, is this on a related point? Thought it might be. You're a politician.
It is, and thanks, Henry, and thanks for putting together today. I think, well, on the funding, I think if you look at West Norfolk, a huge chunk of the council tax that's raised goes straight to the IDB. So I think we could have a conversation about that. But my point is there has been a lot of positive progress over the last few years, and particularly through the work that Rob has come on board with the multi-agency working. I think we can talk a lot more about that and report back to people what's been achieved. But I sit here, and on behalf of my constituents, the question they'll be asking is, so what? So what's going to change as a result of this conference today? I think we need a Norfolk action plan. I think we need the map that George spoke about of where the inland flooding is happening. We need to get pledges about the maintenance that everyone has said is so important. And also, can we capture what is the total funding that's allocated to all the public authorities, other agencies in this room to Norfolk, get that global figure, and then can we make sure it's being spent as effectively as possible? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we put the map of flooding up? I think Mark Ogden, you said it was available. Anyway, it will appear on a screen in a minute. Is your point related, madam? Can you just introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Liz Whitcher, and I'm chairman of what's called the Watton and Seaham Flood Action Group in George's constituency. And we've been working for 7 years with all the agencies to get action in our part of the world, and we have. And I'm here with Jane Witt from South Norfolk, Ketteringham, in a way to represent residents, just ordinary residents. We work very closely with our parish council, but our flood group consists of residents who've been flooded, councillors, and we've, as I say, we've spent a lot of time working together with the agencies. But what happens is, I think that we're talking about how do you communicate and get local people, ordinary people engaged. People often only read what they think refers to them. And our experience is that people who've not been flooded think it doesn't refer to them. Even people who've been flooded think, well, somebody else is going to deal with this. And I've come today really with the idea that, I mean, we've heard about what's happening in the Broads and all sorts of other places. Wouldn't it be positive if the NSFA got together a group of interested residents, committed residents from all parts of Norfolk to think about a strategy of how you do this communication? So that was what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll take that on board and we'll take it up, see what we can do. Anybody else on these related points? Yes, Joe Buxton, the NFU.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two hats on. I'm an agent for a rural insurer and also a representative of the National Farmers Union on a very ground level. So day to day, I don't have a lot of chance to look 100 years ahead. I'm usually getting phone calls from people either flooded, fire damage, or farmers who have lost their factory floor because they need the land to produce the food we eat. They also need the land for biodiversity schemes that they have invested in through public money, which has then been damaged over the last few years with severe flooding. So just on joined up thinking, Laura, just from a DEFRA point of view, could you please tell your colleagues in DEFRA there is a lot of capital investment that is being held up that farmers are desperate to get their hands on because they are losing money through other schemes following the exit from the EU mostly, but governments following that. And those farmers will invest also in methods and the equipment needed to work with the IDBs to help solve flooding issues. So again, just with joined up thinking, and that needs to be within government agencies as well, and be very happy to talk to you after this. Thank you.
Sounds more like a comment than a question, but do you want to come back on that, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly pass that back. We do work really closely with our farming colleagues in DEFRA. It'd be helpful to know a little bit more about what the blockages are, but we can talk about that separately.
I'm conscious we've got people online as well, and they're from parish councils, etc. The flood map is now up behind you, so you can see it's fairly extensive. Fiona, can you read one of the questions from our people online so that they feel included rather than excluded in this wonderful debate?
Absolutely. Thank you. As we are all aware, flooding caused by water running off extra large fields onto the roads is a major problem. The highway drains are not designed to cope with this amount of water, And also the silt and mud that comes with the water results in blocked drains and in turn causes flooding. What can landowners do to minimise field runoff onto the highway, and how can it be more easily enforced?
Do we know which parish council that's from or from whom?
That is from South Lopham.
South Lopham, right. Who'd like to take that? Robin, how do we stop? How do we stop all this sediment getting into your drains and your waterways and clogging up your sewage works?
Thank you, Henry. So I think what we've got to do, I absolutely support James Wild's kind of call for kind of pooling of this funding. What we've got to do is we've got to focus on outcomes rather than output. So if we all carry on spending our own pots and on delivering our own outputs, we're going to get nowhere. So what are the outcomes that communities want to see, and how do we achieve them? How do we work? We need to sort out the governance in order to do that. We need to think about the scale we want to work on. We need the projects to come through to deliver it and share Peter's view. Absolutely, we need imagination. So we've got to kind of, is it best to work with an individual farmer to say, stop? The output we need is you to stop that coming off your field, please, if you don't mind. So build a hedge, do something on yours. That's a rather outputs-based thinking. We need to think much wider within the catchment, or indeed the river basin or the county, whatever. We need to think differently, and we need to just work at all of these different scales. It isn't simply go to that farmer X, and say, put your own wall up or whatever, stop the sediment coming up. That sediment is coming, the water's coming from somewhere, and there will be many reasons why that water is coming from somewhere and is not in the right place. So, it's back to this joined up, it's not just the catchment based approach. It could just be farm clusters, it could be sub-catchments or whatever, but focus on the outcomes that we want. We do not want sediment washing off fields. It is in no farmer's interest to have their most valuable asset, soil, wandering onto people's fields and end up in our sewers. So, support. It's back to the collaborative approach, Henry, working at different scales, having that imagination.
Thank you. Ines, you want to come back?
Yeah, just a couple of things, if I may, on that. I'm just going to mention one word: soil, and management of that soil. And I know that our chairman, Robert Caldwell, was actually at a Fenland Soils meeting just yesterday. And very, very important that we understand going forward how to better manage our soils. In particular, instead of the water going horizontal off those soils, why can't we get it going vertically into the soils a lot more? Open question. The second point, and we're working with DEFRA, the DEFRA farming team on this, is about allowing people to have buffer strips, particularly adjacent to watercourses, to try and pick up the soil before it gets into those watercourses. There's a slight problem that we're trying to deal with at the moment, which is that, of course, those watercourses will require to be maintained. And so we need to get past the hang-up of very occasional traffic across those buffer strips to allow that maintenance to take place. And those of you that have seen the way that some of the maintenance takes place, you can carefully drive a machine over those buffer strips, and quite quickly the grass or the vegetation will bounce up behind that piece of machinery. So we're trying to work with DEFRA at the moment to build in reassurances that farmers and landowners are not going to get penalised for putting in buffer strips alongside watercourses.
Okay.
Yes, well, let's talk about this again in a practical point of view. The last thing we want is soil and silt going onto the highways and getting into the drains, because my highways engineers be the first ones out there wondering what's happening. And often when you find that happening, you have to go back to the beginning and say, is this something that happens every year? Because in some places you get a piece of low-lying road and it's a problem. It's not necessarily something you can easily solve. But in other places, it may be that the farmers change their practice for whatever reason, and you get more runoff than you would normally. So then it's a question of having a conversation with the farmer. But you need to bring all these people together to solve it. But we do have a network of highways engineers across the county. So if you see these problems occurring, then go to your county councillor, and they will bring the highway engineer in, and then you can bring all these agencies together to hopefully solve that problem.
Thank you. Daniel?
And just to, again, the Norfolk Water Fund that we are leading with Anglian Water, Norfolk County Council, Nature Conservancy, took a kind of a strategic spatial look at where you would want to re-engineer watercourses to restore natural processes. Again, that's not just for water resources, water quality, but for flood risk management as well. And we are promised, and we have been promised for a year now from DEFRA and the Environment Agency, a new set of priority kind of water-related actions within ELMS, within the Environmental Land Management System, to incentivise farmers to adopt buffer strips, reconnecting floodplains, to create, I think one of them is even called making space for water. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So we really, well, first we'll call on the Environment Agency and DEFRA to bring forward those priority water-related priority actions as soon as possible. And once they are there, we, working with Strategic Flooding Alliance, maybe can look strategically at which farmers should be adopting different types of measures to make a difference on the ground. And so maybe that's a piece of joint work that we can work together with you on, because one farmer doing the right thing somewhere is not making a difference. But if you get all the farmers within a catchment doing the right things with their land, then you've got a chance to shift the dial.
So the gentleman from Save the Rain, I think, at the back, who's just waving at me.
In our counties. Capturing that water and reusing should be something to be considered. Alongside the maintenance is sexy, I agree. I think that is also required. But changing policy when we come down to abstraction, we're going through in our project at the moment, looking at taking these excess flows and have them in reservoirs to use. But we're hitting problems with the EA policies is there's two sides. One say you can take the water, the other say you can't because it's detrimental to the environment. The other one is, yes, you need it for flood risk. The two sides don't talk. Now, the policies need to change for this to happen, especially for us in our catchments. We've also got over in Suffolk, we've got a farm that we're working with that's taking significant surface water flows, doesn't require abstraction, it's not going into any watercourse, but we're working with them to demonstrate actually the landowners can get a value out of that water, capture it and reuse it on their land. Doesn't need abstraction license for that scenario because it's not going into, it doesn't come under the abstraction policy procedure. I'm just saying this is something I don't know if you're aware that's actually ongoing in Norfolk and Suffolk at the moment. See our planners outside if you do want to chat about a bit more, but we're already looking into making that excess water a valuable commodity.
James Chapman, is this on a related thing?
I'd like to thank Peter for, I think, hopefully it's inspired a number of people and organisations in the room what he achieved. Farmer and a land manager, and I'd like to ask, all we're coming up against is where the funds are going to come from, because we haven't got them. Government has now put hold on everything that should be coming in the right direction. I'm hearing it from the Environment Agency and have done for the last 12 months after flooding that there's no funds there to do the work that's needed. And it's a catch-up problem at the moment because the maintenance hasn't been done over the last number of years. Myself as a landowner, I'm probably speaking for quite a few landowners, that we can live with water, as Peter says, but we've got to have help to do it. I don't know where that help's going to come from financially. And every time we approach as a landowner going forward, we come up against barriers, whether it's environmental barriers or whether it's financial barriers. How is that going to be altered to take us forward?
John, do you want to take that first? I've got Kay also wanting to come in.
Yeah, I think that the challenges were really well described at the back between abstraction and how we store water, abstract water. And again, I know my area colleagues are working on a number of partnerships across the area, across the county, looking at how we get that much better balance, because we want that too. I think water is a great commodity. It's certainly not a waste. We definitely need it at different times of the year, and how we get that balance right is incredibly important. I think that Peter's led on a lot of similar work in the Netherlands on that kind of issue. Funding, certainly coming to your question, has been a challenge. In real terms, the Environment Agency funding for maintenance, so the routine maintenance has stood still despite rising inflation, so we've been able to do less. That was compounded by the kind of 23-24 winter floods when lots of our assets were damaged, particularly in East Anglia. And we, first time probably after a major flood, we didn't receive any extra government funding to help us with that. So we've had to do that within existing budgets, which has then had further impact. What I would say, though, is I'm optimistic for the future. Our new minister, Emma Hardy, a few people have mentioned her today, he definitely sees that we need a much better balance between maintenance and I think someone referred to earlier building shiny new stuff. We've had quite generous settlements to build shiny new stuff, but now we need to invest a lot more in maintaining the assets that ourselves, local councils, internal drainage boards are accountable for. And working with Laura will make a really strong case for that in spending review. But it does feel that we've definitely got the minister behind us in seeking to do that and get that balance right. So hopefully, optimistic, from next year we'll be in a better position.
Thank you, Kay.
Yeah, it was interesting listening to Peter talking about the proportion that happens in the Netherlands compared to what happens in the UK, for the simple reason that we're not as flat. We're flat in this part of the world, but not everywhere. And so our government don't necessarily view the flooding issue in quite the same way, even though we've seen what happened in Somerset. We've seen what's happened in our own county. It was interesting to hear that you could put a levy on council tax that would be specifically for this particular reason, but we are capped. We're not allowed to put our council tax up above 4.99% without asking for sort of special permission. And we spend most of our money on social care because that is the greatest demand on our budget. So other things that are really, really important to the residents in our county tend to get pushed back because of our statutory duties on other things like social care. I spoke to the NFU back last summer at the Norfolk show, and we were talking about reservoirs and how long it takes to get planning permission for a reservoir. It can be 15 years, and that's quite ridiculous because in terms of infrastructure in Norfolk, we have too much water sometimes and not enough water other times. We don't have any power and we certainly don't have any roads. So infrastructure is a major thing for us. And what we need is a relaxation in the planning laws and the red tape that goes on. And that's why it's great to have our MPs here, because these are the guys who are going to be able to make that happen for us. Now, funding who gets what? I suspect that amongst us, there's probably more money, perhaps jointly, than we need to work out who has what, who spends what on where, and how we can better use it. It's the streamlining of the system. It's making us more efficient. We're looking at local government reform here. That means bringing all councils together and being more efficient in bigger units than district councils, for example, and county separately. So there are ways to get around this, but it's going to need a collaborative approach. Norfolk County Council very pleased to be able to support the Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance. We've been able to put a little bit of money your way and some administration help, and we will continue to do that. But I think working collaboratively is the way forward, and this summit is the start of that.
Thank you. Alison, you wanted to come in?
Well, I wanted to ask a question. As a resident and somebody who's been impacted in the way I have, is there an opportunity for this summit to put forward to government that we ought to sort out the riparian responsibilities, and we ought to ensure that we give enforcement powers to somebody, for goodness sake, because nobody has the power to say to somebody, this isn't a we'd like you to. This is, you have a legal duty to keep your watercourse clear, not to just pass the buck onto somebody else. Because if everybody in my area had done that and had fulfilled their responsibilities, it may have changed the situation that we ended up with in Long Stratton. And I'm sure if it happened across the county, it could change the situation in many other flooding events that have happened. So that's a plea from me on behalf of all the residents and all my parishes that were impacted, and the ladies sitting at the front who were equally impacted. Let's have one big push to say we need riparian responsibilities to be enforced. Thank you.
George, it's in your bill, isn't it?
It is. It's in the clause 1, the responsibility section. And
well, let's hope you get it in.
well, I'm working cross-party to that end. Part of the reason for today was to help. We'll come to the actions, Henry, I know in a minute, but I wanted to ask a question just about this map. Thank you for putting it up. Could someone, my eyes, I just struggle with could someone just talk us through what it shows? I think the yellow is internal. Does that mean inside a house? And the red is X. Could someone talk us through it?
Mark, over to you.
Yes, certainly. So what you've got there is points of internal flooding to the property and points of external flooding where we've got reports, but it didn't actually go inside the property. It only relates to 2011 to now. So compared to the, vast history of flooding, it's a tiny snapshot. What it doesn't show is also the heat map. So what you may have there is lots of dots on top of each other. So, if we showed it in a different way, you might have much higher concentrations in places like Attleborough, let's say, than that actually is shown there. So it's not a complete picture. It doesn't show flooding to land. It doesn't show really flooding to road networks, but it's a snapshot of the data we collect.
Henry, can I just to follow up on that? Thank you. It's hugely helpful. If anyone watching this remotely has had a flooding incident, internal or external, and they can't see themselves on that map, how do they let us know so that we can update the map?
So they can report flooding to us various ways. We have the 1 number for flooding. We have ways they can report online, and we always encourage people to report it. They can report it anyway, so as long as it gets through to us in the county council, if it's internal, we will investigate, and then we can update the data as to where the concentrations of flooding are.
Thanks.
As always, the pressure of time is upon us. Robin, you're waving at me furiously.
A furious way, a gentle finger, as Peter was using to move the slides on. Just wanted to just confirm, kind of moving forward. Obviously, it's been a privilege, and we're very proud that we've been able to support Rob in his secondment is leading the NSFA, and he's done a fantastic job. But obviously, Rob is moving on to another role in March. Just wanted to kind of confirm to the audience that as Anglian Water, we're working now with Norfolk County Council to understand how we can co-fund a role for the next 3 years to continue to make sure that Rob's leadership continues. I think this is very, very important that the momentum is maintained and we keep going. So we stand ready to support Norfolk County Council in continuing that role. Thank you.
Thank you for waving at me to tell us that. That's very kind, very important. There is one more question online that Fiona wants to put up.
Okay, so on riparian ownership again, when large organisations build significant sized assets such as culverts, they have maintenance responsibilities. History reveals that these large organisations then divest their responsibilities to the local residents and state that these households are now riparian owners. How is that fair?
Well, it's not, but it's covered in George's bill. That's exactly why the riparian responsibilities are being highlighted. Councillor Richard Price. Now, will you be brief, please?
I'll do my very best, Chair. I'm a Norfolk County Councillor representing parts of the Broads, places that you'll have heard of, Hickling, Horning and Potter Heigham.
Brief.
They were subject to flood alerts for over 120 days last winter, with lots of repercussions, terrific community support, particularly from volunteer flood wardens from the North Norfolk District Council. But crucially, today we also have drought in our title. So looking ahead, we need to do everything we can to support our farmers. And some of my farmers are taking it very seriously, and they are spending large sums of money on creating reservoirs. But to fill the reservoir is a different matter, because the Environment Agency says, well, you can't pump from the dikes, you can't pump from the rivers, it'll increase the saline and everything else. And there are too many obstacles, and the planning permission for a reservoir, I believe, only lasts for 5 years, which makes the finances very difficult. So my ask is for the agencies, and we've made so much progress on making our villages safer, thanks to the cooperation spearheaded by Rob in the last year. to recover from the flood, so we're much better prepared. But can I ask the agencies now to work together to support our farmers, to find a simple way of saying, yes, when extreme weather water levels exist, you can take water from the dikes or from the river under these criteria. But perhaps in extreme cases of drought, we might ask you to put a little bit of that water back into the river. But it needs communication, and most crucially, if we don't support our farmers, we won't have anything to eat. Thank you.
Okay, well, this neatly brings us on to conclusions and actions. So, John, what can you do about it, please?
So it's a really good question. I think it's similar to what were raised with other questions earlier. We're definitely looking at this. There has been some changes. We call them regulatory position statements, which is a bit dry, but that means under certain circumstances, high flows, landowners can take water. We need to check the detail whether that's a one-off opportunity, and after that you have to adjust your license. But I know that our local colleagues are working really hard in a few partnerships to enable, so I'm sure they'd be happy to catch up with you afterwards and talk about your particular circumstance for your local farmers. And if I may, while I've got shameless plug, Henry, talking about flood risk mapping, the Environment Agency, having worked with lots of partners, has just released in the last month a big step change, updated flood map. So our National Flood Risk Assessment, which we've turned into an acronym, NAFRA, obviously, and our Coastal Erosion Risk Maps, that was only launched a couple of days ago. They're all available now on gov.uk. Go and look. It's much better information than it has been. And perhaps, Henry, Fiona, we can share those links afterwards so people can go and see.
Really helpful. There's a gentleman at the back, take chairman's privilege, who will be the last question, sir. So can you speak loudly because you're not in front of a microphone?
But how do we identify? And second point, powers before, are they going to be simple access? We actually do that. Kate and I, we see it on the ground, we're out on site, we visit people, we identify the issues, but if people choose not to do it, we're so limited in actually enforcing it. And enforcement is the key for me. I think, you know, we can be great, we can write the flood investigation report so we can identify where the issues are. But if we don't enforce and we don't change, it's pointless. That's the key.
Are you seeing the solutions in the hands of the local authorities to enforce?
And enforce on them. Powers of enforcement simpler, and the awareness needs to be put to people. Look, if you're not going to undertake your responsibility, there's going to be repercussions, and that's where we sit with a lot of problems that Katie and I see on the ground.
Thank you very much. I mean, you make a very powerful point, and it comes back to this communication thing, doesn't it, with local people? And Liz, you made the point about what you'd like to see as people coming together through the role through the NSFA and actually bringing together. It also picks up on Professor O'Riordan's point that I'm running after the train and I'm never going to catch it. I live in hope, Tim. I live in hope because I'm a great believer in the people of Norfolk. And I think if the people of Norfolk come together and we work together, there is hope. Oh, that's approval, is it?
It's the only way, Henry. We have to work together. And what Peter was saying is so important. Awareness, creating real community mobilization. People care about where they live and they care about their futures. Maximize that enthusiasm and give us the resources to do it. That's one of the most important lessons of today.
But I think also one of the important lessons is the ability to unlock the bureaucracy that is often frustrating people. I see you smiling, Laura, but it is on the ground very important. Now, as an action, what can you take away from today that you're going to do that is going to change the lives and the frustrations of many of these people? please share it with us. I've got your back. I'll support you.
I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's incredibly important actually for me to come out and hear all of these things and go to various events. I've been to one of the APPGs actually on flooding, and that was also a really helpful insight for me. I think my plea is, like, it's really important for us to get the information and the feedback from communities. So we're going to be consulting in the spring. Please find a way to provide that input. It is really valuable. And I will stop there.
Robin, what are you going to do, please?
So as Anglian Water, we have just had our kind of funding settlement for the next 5 years agreed, and we have over £700 million worth of investment coming into Norfolk from Anglian Water, of which about 140 million is directly related to resilience to drought and flood. So we will spend that, but we do not wish to spend that on our own. We will spend that in partnership with everybody around this room. One of the things we are looking at, I mentioned kind of an outputs-based approach very traditionally. So we have a £4 billion environment programme, which is very, very focused on kind of outputs, reduce phosphate here, storm overflows, is point source. We've managed to carve out, with the Environment Agency and Ofwat's approval, £26 million to take a more outcomes-based approach under our advanced WINEP, and that's the programme that we will fund. We will co-fund the new role for Rob's successor. Within that, we will be setting up a partnership centre of excellence, and Norfolk is the place that we wish to embed that partnership centre of excellence to look across all aspects of water management, drought, flood, and water quality as well. So that's our commitment. We will be staffing that partnership centre of excellence with this won't be a bunch of Anglian Water people. This will be representatives from within this room. So that's our commitment. We are very serious about this. We want to look at how we take a much more outcomes-based approach, a much more place-based approach, much more integrated approach moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan Goodchild, are you going to come up with an action for me?
Thank you, Chair. Alan Goodchild, Managing Director of Goodchild Marine, based at Borough Castle, and also Chairman of the Navigation Committee for the Broads Authority. I think my question is aimed at the Environment Agency. I'm aware of the tidal locking we're seeing on the Bure and the consequences of that up at Hickling and the upper Bure regions where we've seen water not getting away. There's been a lot of debate about the Bure hump, which is a restriction in the river, and it is definitely there, being the cause. And I'm aware of the Jacobs report, which studied that and revealed dredging. So I don't dispute the results of that study. What I would like to urge, I have a theory that the training wall at the bottom of the Bure is actually the cause, and the effect of that cause is the Bure hump. And I would like to see the modelling which was done by Jacobs rejigged to show what would happen if that training wall was reinstated. We don't see any tidal locking at Borough Castle. We get massive tidal rushes come in, which they see up at the Bure as well, but water gets away very quickly. What I'm witnessing is at the bottom of the Bure, the flow coming down Braden is stalling the flow out of the Bure because the training wall has eroded away over many years. I have got some reports here I'm happy to share with people. That's my theory, but I do believe that the Venturi effect that would cause if that was reinstated would actually help draw water out of the Bure on an ebb tide, which currently we're not seeing.
Okay, John, can you give him some assurance that you'll engage with him on this?
I'm definitely sure our local area director, Graham Verry, would be happy to discuss that. In fact, we were discussing that this morning, the very issue. So
very good. And he's already putting his thumb up, as is David Cameron. You've got 3 Environment Agency people who are all going to make it happen. It is being minuted. George.
Henry, thank you. Just on the actions.
Yeah.
It's great to hear the organisations offer some actions. Can I suggest a few as well for consideration? And
I think you've started.
On the map, could I ask that it's circulated and that we take an action to develop it? It'd be nice to see the catchments on it rather than perhaps the roads, and make sure it's up to date and that everyone involved is aware of it and can see it and update it. So it's a living document. Secondly, and also, I'm very conscious that in some parts of Norfolk, we're about to see huge increases in housing. Breckland's target is up 50% on a pretty high number already. So it'd be nice to start to forecast where we think it's going to get a lot worse. Secondly, on the budget point, could we just do a really simple list of all the organisations in Norfolk who've got a responsibility and a little bit of budget. It will be little, but if you tot it up, we'll be surprised, I think, how much totted up it is. And if we then develop this alliance, we'll have a budget. And third, somebody made the suggestion of a residents' action plan. I think it was Liz. Can I endorse that? I think we don't want thousands of people, but a group of people who've really lived the experience and can just make sure that they're holding us to account properly. And fourth, could we actually circulate a draft of a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plan for Norfolk for this year of things that, there's only so many resources, but the things that we're going to prioritise. I'll take the fifth action on the bill, and if everyone could please send through any specific things that you think this bill ought to include. Not a long speech, we've done that, but the specifics, I will then circulate back the next final draft and then work cross-party on it. But I think we need to show people today that there's a list of really clear, specific actions, and I'd like to nominate those.
If you do 5, the bill, I'll undertake to ensure we do the others.
Great.
That's a yes. Right, we read sort of, it says on my agenda that there's quarter of an hour for chairman's summary. Well, if I took quarter of an hour, you'd all be overdue and we'd be late running this meeting. So I'm not going to try and summarize, but what I am going to do is to thank very sincerely you guys for your participation, the people who are online, the people who've spoken, our panelists, but I'm also going to add a plea. And the plea is, please go away and do something different that actually helps the residents of Norfolk and doesn't hinder them, because I've detected quite a lot of frustration in the room, frustration that, well, we say this, but nothing happens. And actually we can do something about that, because it's all about the power of the can do rather than the we can't, it's too difficult. And I think Norfolk is such a special place that it deserves all of our efforts to protect it, to preserve its nature, to run after that train, Tim, because we're full of hope and meet the challenges, and we'll only solve the problems by working together. And actually working together isn't frightening. It really isn't. It's just built on trust, as I said earlier. And once you get trust, you get action. So it's up to us. Don't blame somebody else. It's up to us. So help me, because I want to make it happen. So thank you all so much. Give yourselves a warm hand of applause. Give these guys a huge thanks, particularly Peter, all the way from the Netherlands. Yes, your English is very broken, Peter, but my Dutch is absolute rubbish. But thank you all very much indeed, each and every one of you. I'm so grateful. Thank you.